Good afternoon, good day, good evening. Um, I am Sapio Fayal, and this is Ask a Mom: Operator Syndrome, Mental Health, and What is Really Killing the Kids. We're going to discuss the space and technology industry, workers' rights, and the cost of cognitive warfare. What does all of this have to do with each other? I spent 20 years in the space and military intelligence industry looking at how technology is used to exploit during wartime operations. Um, and it has taken its toll on myself, my family, my husband, who we met in Iraq. Um, and that's a fun story, but what operator syndrome is, if you're new to listening and just what I've been talking about, is it's a complex myriad of medical, psychological, social, and existential challenges that primarily affect special operation forces, but it also affects other tactical professions that have high stress and high performance careers. I was a intelligence operator supporting special forces missions for most of my time, and with the information that you are exposed to on top of the technology and the impacts of said technology on your body. Then you add in toxic work environments, whether that is environmental toxins or societal toxins, as you have personalities that in those high stress, high performance can become toxic very easily, very quickly. And all of that wraps up into operator syndrome. I started kind of looking into and understanding the various impacts as my husband and I were navigating the VA system to manage our various chronic pain symptoms, as well as PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And as I did that, I began to also look into just other individuals' experiences. That's led me to learning a little bit about Havana syndrome, which is more of the physical manifestations of advanced technologies used against individuals. Operator syndrome is kind of in that same category, that we don't fully understand the effects, how all of the various symptoms occur, but also we're still learning and trying to figure that out. And one of the ways that we do that is by talking about it and helping others to understand and bring their stories forward, so that way we can learn from each other and help each other be able to survive in a new environment. Today, we are going to be talking about information and data systems. So I am an ethical social engineer. The reason I go social engineering by the basic cybersecurity and red team, blue team, defense, offense stances, because my focus has always been on understanding the societal impacts of all of the various technologies. And that's where, I started digging into and putting together this wonderful collection of slides to help you sail the data sea, because the internet, consisting of all of this social, economic, and government systems that combine make up the internet and all of the data that exists on Earth, um, rather than a data lake, which is what a lot of this terminology that in machine learning and whatnot, they'll talk about data lakes. I go with data sea because you don't really know where it starts, where it ends. There's lots of dark, bottomless places that are very difficult to find your way out of. However, if you learn how to navigate it, you're able to navigate the world. And so that is the big thing with digital literacy, on making sure that individuals know and understand these highly technical systems in a manner that makes sense, it's not scary, and can be used to create equity and inclusive environments for all human beings to survive. So, first thing we're going to talk about is what's wrong with all the various systems. And with data security, with information security, all of that, it's very reactive with no understanding. So all of a sudden, red lights are blinking and you have to react to it. And you have to know, okay, what is going on? And quite often it's not until, days after an incident that incident response is able to actually understand the full picture and the full impact of a particular attack. And that's because you have to know what you're looking for. You have to know where it's located. And you need to have the need to know, which is highly subjective. And need to know is a term that is used within the intelligence community so often, because of all of the various special access programs and maintaining that operational security of, if you are not partaking in a certain operation, there's no reason you need to know anything about said operation. And with that, quite often it depends on, who is running the operation, what is the goal. And that's where, with all the systems, no one can decide on what the end goal is. I mean, you can look in the news with the current state of the Iran war as a great example of getting into something with no understandable plan, no goal in mind, no endpoint to work towards. And because everyone has a different idea, you have individuals all going in different directions. So, what's the difference between the social, economic, and government systems that we deal in? So, social systems deal with private and health information. These are the secrets that we would like to keep from the world until the most opportune time. And the most opportune time could be, what's best for me as the individual with that information, or it could be any number of ways of defining the most opportune time, whether it's, you know, a financial intelligence information that you're dealing with and you're wanting to make money on the stock market or anything like that. These various secrets, quite often called trade secrets, when we get into the economic elements of information and systems, but the social aspects of it are those pieces of information that are often held against an individual, especially in the um, realm of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Um, you know, some of those very private occurrences and instances that individuals have lived through. They don't want the whole world to know that. And um, like I said, that private information quite often outside of the clear defined parameters of what happened in that situation, things get real sticky real fast. So economic is dealing with all of the financial information. This is what we're allowed to trade and how those affect both what is private and what is public information. So the world deals in private information and public information. Public information is considered common knowledge, where private information is those secrets or the specific ways and means of how things work that would give a competitor an edge, as well as how the various trade deals kind of work out and going into tariffs and taxes and all of that stuff, where we move into the government, which deals with how information is used and shared. So government systems are probably the least understood realm when you go to what's private and what's public. But government information is supposed to be public information. It's supposed to establish the baseline of knowledge that everyone is aware of and put those guardrails on to ensure new technologies, new products, new anything are going to be protected and, well, not be protected. They are going to not cause harm to the societal peace. So, what do they all have in common? So, in all of the systems, people want to hoard the information. They feel that if I have the information, I know how to, play the game, essentially. And because of that, they want to vacuum up as much information as humanly possible so that way it's theirs. And it comes into each one believes that they have all the answers and they want you to believe that they have all the answers, because if an organization has all the information and all the um, answers for whatever ailment you find yourself in, then they're able to leverage that against you to say, okay, well, if you want your, oh, look, you broke your leg. if you want to that to heal properly, then you have to come and go to the hospital and have it set properly and all of these things, which then bring in finances and the exchange of money and all of that stuff. But data in and of itself is attached to not just a human, but it is attached to someone who felt it was important enough to write down. And with that, there's this idea of ownership. It's my data. And you want to know who owns the data as well as who owns the story or the narrative that that data is used to create. And just because someone slaps their name on it doesn't mean that it's theirs. Because there are all sorts of different things that, and I think one of the biggest, easiest ways to show that is different celebrities on putting their face on products in order to help sell said products and creating those revenue streams by lending their image or licensing their image to another entity in order to use their image. And when it comes to the data itself, just because, an individual says, hey, this is mine, doesn't necessarily make it theirs. Because when it comes to data, one, you need to know how to use the data. If you don't know how to use it, all that information is useless. The other thing with data is you can have all the data in the world. And if you don't have someone who understands how all of the data points fit together in order to create that full story, and the full story that the data is telling you, not the story you want the data to tell you, that again makes it useless. Another element is, are you willing to destroy it just to prove a point? A great example of this is the workers who are burning warehouses down to prove a point that they are being, they can't live, and they're going to the extreme of being willing to destroy the product, the data, whatever, just to bring light to the fact that they're living in, they do not have sustainable living. And then it comes to the element is, if that happens, if all of the information is destroyed, are you willing to start over? And is it possible to start over? So, especially when it comes to massive amounts of information, if you don't have a backup of said information, are you going to be able to start back over? And that's where the element of resiliency in your data comes into play. So why does ownership matter? Ownership matters because ownership defines the responsibility and the liability. So they're able to, if something goes wrong, who is responsible for that situation? The other thing is that ownership drives innovation. Whoever owns the data gets to kind of navigate Um, sorry. So whoever owns the data is able to drive innovation in a certain direction and kind of state what that information is able to be used for. Ownership also creates the security and generational wealth. So as information is used to create knowledge and understanding on various topics, that also creates security and generational wealth for those individuals who are a part of it. And that's where ownership is really about freedom and control. So whoever owns the data gets to, kind of talk through what the data is saying, gets to help navigate what we're doing with that information, and creates avenues to leverage that information to create safety and generational wealth. So, this is why data matters. It is also why data is quite often extremely biased and only includes certain individuals because of that element of ownership and being able to leverage that data for control of the narrative. So right now, probably my favorite thing or to remind people about, talk about, is um, the Freedom of Information Act of 1966. And basically, what that says is all government information, all information is free. However, you have to know what information you're requesting access to in order to be able to kind of start piecing things together. So, in the realm of like massive data center, which is what I kind of drew out up top, is we have these databases. Each of the databases have information that is owned by a different entity. You have to know what entity owns the information you're looking for. And some of those organizations will slap it on a t-shirt and tell you right up front, hey, this is who we are. Others, not so much. So you have to understand the various jurisdictional lines when it comes to gaining access to various elements of information. The other step that goes in there is there is some information that is private, and then there's some information that is public. So all of those delineations really come into one, who owns the information, but also it comes into whether or not that information is tied to an active operation or tied to a living individual. And if it's tied to a living individual or even an individual who has passed in the you know, past handful of years. In order to get access to certain pieces of information, you have to prove that, hey, I am the next of kin, so I can access this individual's information. Or like being able to navigate that element of what's the information you're looking for, where is it, who controls it, what documents are required in order to request access to that. And then, as all of the various information systems and who has access to what intellectual property, it all comes into this dynamic of having to being able to prove that that information is indeed yours and that you are the individual who's able to control the narrative of that information and what the narrative of whatever that information is tied to. So, if that's how everything has gone for, make this not be real bad. Come on. Where we can look at it better. There we go. All right. So what I've done is I've put together this little timeline of different elements that have changed the narrative that we're looking at, and looking at major differences of opinions that kind of changed how the story is looked at. So, first off, you have to understand how information is processed. So, this right here is the information life cycle. So, you have the information is collected, the information is processed, and what that means is like someone tells a story, that story is written down. The analyzed information is that story is then analyzed to determine, okay, like, is this accurate? What is, what happened? What, all of those various things where you analyze the information, and then the information is disseminated. Now, all sorts of different people will collect information. They will process it. Not as many will fully analyze it, or they will analyze it in a manner that is incredibly biased. So, on my little timeline up here, we're going to start with 1776, when there were lots of things going on in the world, but the biggest thing was the fact that there was an authoritarian, so concentrated and centralized authority on the world narrative. And that was in tandem the church and the state. And as the narrative began to, as people began to poke holes in the narrative and ask more questions, the Illuminati organization, and this came up in Bolivia, Germany first. So it really was a real organization. It's not what everyone, or it's not what conspiracy theorists like to talk about, but It really did exist. And what it was it was actually a book club. And what they decided was, we spend a lot of time studying the Bible and the canonical books that, you know, people have deemed to be true. What if we started analyzing all stories in that manner, and what could we learn from that? So this book club started to explore different ideas of thought. And as that occurred, you started to see the growth of various secret societies because of the fact that they were learning outside of the confines of the church, and I'd say church with like a big C, and that really comes into, you have the Catholic Church, and we can go through all of the breaks of the religious history of stuff, but just for this, that's all you need to know, is that the religious didn't was where all of the learning was focused, and as it started to move away from the social science background of understanding to the applied sciences and understanding how all of these stories over time affect communities and all that, the various secret societies started to pop up. And, you had Freemasons, the Illuminati. The Bohemian Grove is another fun one that was established in the San Francisco area. It's a fun one to Google and look at if you haven't, especially when it comes to the power structures of American politics. But as these narratives and these ideas of who had rights to claim how the story was written, essentially, we also had different presidents start to become assassinated, and world leaders started to be assassinated because of these differences of opinion between the authoritarian, everything is concentrated and centralized, and the anarchist mentality of everything is individualized and should be completely decentralized. And between both of these and controlling the narrative through lies, fear, and money. So you had Andrew Jackson, President Lincoln, then you had Garfield, McKinley, Roosevelt. Roosevelt wasn't assassinated, but he had an attempted assassination. And I think Garfield was another one that it was attempted but not carried out. Then with World War One, started with the assassination of the Archduke of, why can't I remember? Anywho, and all of it kind of stemming from the moving of information and going back and forth between the ideas of, should the world story be centralized concentrated and controlled by a single entity, or should it be individualized and decentralized? And how does the global story of, you know, how humans came to existence, what is and is not considered permissible, all of those things come into play. So then in 1969, ARPANET, which was the predecessor to the internet, ARPANET came online, and that was for research, mostly military use. Then you had in 1980, CNN established the first 24-hour news cycle. 10 years later, the World Wide Web came online, and now everyone had access to information at the rate of dial-up, which only the real ones understand the pain of picking up the phone to call your friend and hearing the fax tones. Anywho, not fax tones, but you get what I'm saying. And then in 1999, we had the Columbine shooting. And again, going back and forth between releasing all of this information and people having access to all the information that they want, and then going back and forth between, okay, who should be in control of the information and the narrative that we're working on. And you have the authoritarian, where everything should be concentrated and centralized, all the way to the anarchist mentality of everything should be individualized and decentralized. And we still have the circle of information rolling through. The information life cycle of collecting the information, processing it, analyzing it, disseminating it. And every time that cycle goes around and new information comes into the picture, the narrative changes. So as we continue to roll through what information is available, who is it available to, at what rate are they able to access said information, you have various individuals who are leveraging the lies, the fears, and money in order to create these extremely high control situation groups. That's where you have the notorious and historical American cults coming out as, you have the Manson family in 69. People's Temple or Jonestown was in 78. Then you had the Branch Davidians, David Idiot, I don't know how to say that, in 93, and then Heaven's Gate in 97. And all of it was done through these going through information. So 93, the Davidians, that was Waco, just for references and whatnot. They create, so the way cults and whatnot work is they control the narrative so much that those within that circle only trust the narrative of those individuals who are trusted. And individuals who are outside of that circle are seen as suspicious. They quite often will draw divides with in between families, and whether it is through lies, through fears of, and it's funny how they leverage fear because they will control you through fear of others controlling you. And they will like play it off that, oh, your family is so controlling, you need to, here, we'll help you. And that's kind of how that kind of happens. Today, the biggest active and known high control groups are the 12 tribes, which was founded in the 70s. And that whole idea has, they're attempting to recreate the first century church. But all of these groups, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Family International, formerly Children of God. Another one I would add here that I did not originally is the Church of Scientology. And that one is kind of interesting because I grew up in Clearwater, so I got to see firsthand how they would kind of work to create those barriers for individuals who are within the church to view outsiders in various different ways. So, but a lot of this stuff would surround the elements of child abuse, labor exploitation, and extreme sexual practices and manipulation. So, as we start painting the whole beautiful picture of these information and data systems and how things are decentralized versus centralized, or some of the information is centralized in a decentralized way based off of who controls the narrative of that particular piece of information. So now, as all of that is going on, we also have the, invention of television. We have internet and phone lines and all of these various ways of sharing information and being able to, or not being able to discuss certain topics because of secrets and what is and is not appropriate to talk about in various settings. So, as we're looking at it from a social engineering standpoint, and how do we ensure that the narrative is not being manipulated while still ensuring that everyone's rights are being met, that there is time to go through it, and we end up in this big, beautiful mess that is the United States government. And that is where we're going to pick up later. where we're going to take all of this understanding and information about information and data systems and controlling the narrative. And now we're going to start pulling on that thread to talk through the various elements of where we find the US today, the implications and just various situations that have occurred within the Epstein class of individuals who, again, when we talk about high control groups of keeping secrets, extreme sexual practices, manipulation, labor exploitation, and basically creating an environment where, oh, we're family, which means you have to do whatever I say, or I own you, so you have to do what I say. And what that element of ownership looks like as we, as a country, have gone through sharing all of this information, and yet we still find ourselves within the same patterns of manipulation and exploitation, and how we can begin to put in the necessary guardrails. We'll talk about guardrails too. The necessary guardrails to ensure informed consent in everything from work to sex to conversations to like informed consent across the board, and how we can do better to build a more loving and inclusive community. But I think we'll kind of close up there. Don't forget, we have cyberspace summer camp kicking off on May 1st. From May Day to Labor Day, we're going to be going through a whole hybrid summer series focused at the high school knowledge level. We may, depending on participants and how we want to navigate it, but there's going to be various events. We're going to have roller skating days and learning work skills, technology. We're going to get our hands dirty and attempt to grow things. And we're going to do all of that with this idea of how to survive the 80s when growing up meant the possibility of scars and the guarantee of stories. And yes, you are going to get to enjoy all the fun 80s, 90s stories that I could possibly find, come up with, talk about the shenanigans that I know have happened. However, again, going back to controlling the narrative and what you're able to prove versus what you can't prove when it comes to control of the narrative. Excuse me. It's going to be super fun. You'll learn the Pixar didn't happen, although now with AI, even sometimes with pics, you've got to question them now. So we're going to look at that and determining how you can identify deep fakes. learn how to make friends and build community. Um, but yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And there's going to be more of my random in the car talking, as well as the next episode of Ask a Mom, where we will begin to dive into the 2000s to now on what do we know is true about the various narratives we're seeing play out before our very eyes, whether it's the Epstein class or just what we see on the internet. Do we know what is real, what's not real? What about the effects of very graphic content on an individual, whether that's violent video games or, you know, when war scenes are streamed across our feed, what what and how all of that does to us as humans. But then as technology continues to advance and we get into the elements of cognitive warfare and how narrative hijacking can occur, whether that is in your head and getting gaslit by a narcissistic individual in your life, or a difficulty remembering past events because of the stress that had surrounded this situation. So we can really dig into this idea of mental health and the impact of just how life has been lived over, the past quarter of a century. And that's where we're going to pick up next. So stay tuned. Have a great one. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye.